Welcome back, everyone. Now to introduce Elisa Adami. Elisa Adami recently completed her PhD at the Royal College of Art in London. Her dissertation focused on radical historiographical practices in the work of Lebanese artists of the post-war generation. She teaches at the Royal College of Art and Kingston University, and she is the editorial assistant of the book series Research Practice, published by Sternberg Press. Elisa's writings have appeared in academic publications such as the Journal of Visual Culture and Third Text, and she is a regular contributor to Art Monthly. She's also co-founder and co-director of Nemascape, an online publishing platform and network dedicated to contemporary art practices, exploring issues of memory, history, and the archival impulse. Elisa's presentation is called Decolonial Dovetailing, Potential Encounters and Archival Elisions in Thorold Dickinson's Archive.
Thank you very much, Susan, for the introduction. And I want to thank everyone at the Institute for organizing this symposium today, and also for supporting us throughout the process of the research. And I want also to thank all the archivists and librarians whose help has been really invaluable. So I'm going to share my screen now so you can see my presentation. Okay. Perfect. Okay, so as Susan said, my presentation is titled Decolonial Dovetailing, Potential Encounters and Archival Elisions in Thorold Dickinson's Archive. And I've conducted research in the archive of Thorold Dickinson, who was a British filmmaker, and the archive is housed at the Archive and Special Collections Centre at LCC. I focus in particular on a micro event, which was a screening that Dickinson organized in 1937. And I will be reading a paper that I'm writing now. In December 1937, at the London Film Society, Thorold Dickinson and Ivor Montagu presented a program that dovetailed alternate reels from Italian and Russian propaganda films, showing the fascist invasion of Abyssinia, as Ethiopia was then called. The Path of the Heroes, the bombastic official account commissioned by the fascist regime, was juxtaposed with Abyssinia, a Soviet counter-propaganda film documenting the war from the opposite side. The crass glorification of Italian military and technological prowess was placed side by side with its murderous consequences on the ground, the use of poison gas, atrocities, and mass murder that were conveniently removed in the sanitized fascist version. The horror undercut the pomp. Shot, countershot. The program was titled Record of War. Although the accompanying notes shed away from any compromising political reference, its intention was clear. Fascinated by the aesthetic and political principle of montage, Dickinson applied a specialized version of cinematic montage to the reels of two documentary films. In doing so, the propaganda of Mussolini's regime was turned against itself, and the brutality of Italian imperialist aggression was put on display. The verb to dovetail denotes the act of skillfully fitting together two different pieces to form a whole. As every carpenter knows, a dovetail joint consists of two interlocking pieces of wood, a flaring tenon and a mortise, which when fitted together resist being pulled apart in all directions except one. History is also comprised of a series of interlocking joints. This act of joining and the historical edifice that it serves to build is neither stable nor settled, but consists of an endless and multidirectional process of deconstruction and reconstruction. Yet so many pieces and fragments of the past remain occluded by or missing from the archive, which endeavors to construct its image of history out of partial and hegemonic narratives. A record is always missing, misplaced, mislabeled, redacted, embargoed, classified, lost, damaged, segregated. History breaks down into specialisms. The connection between adjacent events are severed in their separate cataloguing. In the Thorold Dickinson's collection at the UAL Archive and Special Collections Center, I look for traces of a micro-event and its potential political links with the individuals and communities involved in the Pan-African movement and anti-colonial struggle during the same period. I'm in an archive of presence. 30 grey boxes and approximately 3,000 books and periodicals are arranged on 33 shelves. The boxes contain scripts, screenplays, and treatments, notes, press cuttings, reports, letters, film programs, teaching notes, and conference papers. This is an archive about British film history and British film studies. It's unlikely I'll find here anything related to the history of Pan-Africanism or anti-colonial resistance movements, but I search nonetheless. I'm looking for traces of lives and ideas which are archived elsewhere, in the archives of radical, self-funded organizations, or in the classified shelves of state surveillance apparatuses. Sometimes they are not archived at all. And yet the history and legacy of empire seeps through and stains many of these documents. It is discernible in the choice of shooting locations, the subject matter of films, realized or unrealized, and commissioning bodies. What if I was to dovetail these documents with the words and deeds of Pan-African and anti-colonial intellectuals? What new meanings would this unforeseen proximity between Dickinson and his contemporaries generate? What would it tell us about the still distorted and disavowed legacy of the British Empire? This act of dovetailing does not intend to restore a unity that never was, but to bring together disparate and contrasting experiences and memories in jarring juxtaposition. This critical historical montage method draws on Edward Said's notion of contrapunctual reading. In Culture and Imperialism, Said invites us to look back at the cultural archive of empire not univocally as a symphonic harmony, but contrapunctually as an atonal ensemble of historical processes and experiences connected by colonial violence. A contrapunctual approach to history, for instance, must take account of how a certain lifestyle in 19th century Europe was made possible by overseas colonial exploitation, as well as the way in which dominant narratives were to forcibly exclude and repress particular histories and experiences. Following Said, my research attempts to trace the networks of intertwined and overlapping cultural and political events, as well as what these connections may tell us about the enduring historical legacies of empire and colonialism. File 1, Pan-African Voices, Potential Encounters and Archival Elisions. About the 1937 screening, Dickinson would later recall, "Our fashionable Sunday audience, with their broad brims and capes and capacity for chatter, drifted out into Regent Street in dead, awed silence." What was that uneasy silence made of? Were they shocked by the brutal violence they saw? Were they ashamed by the British government's complicit inaction? Were they thinking of the crimes that had been and continued to be committed by the British colonial empire too? And were there any Ethiopian, African, Caribbean spectators among this fashionable Sunday crowd? Did any member of the International African Friends of Ethiopia, for instance, attend the event? For those who knew on their skin the wickedness of colonialism, the pain would have not been something easy to dispel in the murk of a December evening. Walking down a London street in May 1935, the young student Francis Nkrumah was feeling dispirited and pondering returning home rather than continuing his onward journey to study in the United States, when he heard an excited newspaper boy shouting something unintelligible. As the boy grabbed a bundle of the latest editions, Nkrumah caught sight of the headline on a placard, "Mussolini invades Ethiopia." He would note famously in his autobiography that this shocking piece of news was all that he needed to overcome his malaise. At that moment, it was almost as if the whole and declare war on me personally. For the next few minutes, I could do nothing but glare at each impassive face, wondering if those people could possibly realize the wickedness of colonialism. The Italian invasion of Ethiopia was arguably the single event in the period that most powerfully inflamed the imagination of Black people and colonized subjects around the world, serving as the rallying call for an emergent anti-colonial movement. In the 30s, Ethiopia was the only sovereign Black state to be recognized as a member of the League of Nations. Liberia, the other notionally independent Black nation, had become an American protectorate and mortgaged to the Firestone Rubber Company, thanks to the machinations of Yankee dollar diplomacy, as George Padmore eloquently put it. An attack on the very principle of Black sovereignty at a time when the great majority of Africans and people of African descent lived under colonial domination or racial segregation. The reverberations of the Italian aggression were felt across continents, reaching as far as China. The global and largely spontaneous character of the Black response, Cedric Robinson explained, was due to the symbolic value of Ethiopia, a country confluent with the notion of Africa in the mind of diasporic communities. The mobilization spread like wildfire. In the US, as the crisis emerged from late 1934, Black-led aid organizations proliferated. Elsewhere, 100 Liberian, Ovambo, and Karo dock workers in Southwest Africa refused to work on Italian ships. In Kenya, the Kikuyu Central Association enlisted volunteers for the campaign in Ethiopia. Egyptian doctors reported to Addis Ababa, and hundreds of West Indians from British Guiana, Cuba, and Trinidad, the Bahamas requested permission from their colonial authorities to enlist in the armies of Ethiopia. In London, African and West Indian intellectuals, workers, and students, despite reservations about the emperor's rule and his racial misconceptions, organized public demonstrations in order to pressure the British government into support of Ethiopia. In this constellation of nodes of anti-colonial insurgency, London was, as per Minka Makalani's effective characterization, a unique incubator for radical Black internationalist discourse. This coalesced particularly around the International African Friends of Abyssinia, promptly renamed to International African Friends of Ethiopia, an organization formed in London in July 1935 by Ciela James, Amy Ashwood-Garvey, Chris Braithwaite, Jomo Kenyatta, George Padmore, and others to support Ethiopia's struggle to maintain its independence. After the defeat of the Ethiopians with the fall of the capital city Addis Ababa in May 1936, the organization would eventually change its name to the International African Service Bureau and increasingly shift its attention from Italy's invasion of Ethiopia to the deplorable conditions in the British colonies throughout West Africa. Dickinson Record of War was screened at the New Gallery Cinema on 121-25 Regent Street, house of the London Film Society. Just down the road, at 50 Carnaby Street, was the Florence Mills Social Parlour, a nightclub and a restaurant run by Amy Ashwood-Garvey and her husband, singer-comedian Sam Manning, that served as unofficial headquarters of the International African Friends of Ethiopia. Figures whose lives the archive remembers as separate may well have brushed shoulders in Regent Street on a busy Sunday evening. The geographic proximity in the urban fabric of a colonial metropole stands in stark contrast with their archival segregation. I ask again, was any member of the International African Friends of Ethiopia, by then International African Service Bureau, in attendance at the screening of Record of War? As I continue to speculate about potential encounters, I find a newspaper cutout announcing the screening of two films, a fascist propaganda film paired with a film shot by Russian operators at the Phoenix Theatre in Charing Cross Road on Tuesday, 15 February 1938, around 2 months after Dickinson's program was shown. Organized by British suffragette Sylvia Pankhurst, editor of the campaigning newspaper New Times and Ethiopia News, The screening was preceded by an address of the Abyssinian Emperor Haile Selassie, who had fled into exile in England after the Italian victory. Originally, Pankhurst had planned to include the Path of Heroes in the program, a telling detail that seems to confirm that she had seen Record of War and probably took from there the idea of repeating the juxtaposition of films without the technical refinement of Dickinson's dovetailing method. However, Istituto Luce, the Italian State Film Corporation, complained about the unauthorized interpolation of the Path of Heroes in the Film Society screening and suppressed its use for future unofficial presentations. Henry K. Miller, a film scholar who in 2000 organized a reenactment of Dickinson's 1937 program, speculated about potential encounters between the British director and Pan-African intellectuals and activists too. It is unclear, he writes, whether C.L.R. James and his Pan-Africanist confederates in the International African Service Bureau saw Record of War, adding is as if to substantiate the hypothesis that the International African Service Bureau was in contact with Pankhurst's organization, and James was an admirer of the Russian films in which the society specialized. I realized that my obsession to discover traces of encounters that may have not even happened may lead nowhere. Even if I was to find evidence that an encounter took place, what would that prove? Perhaps a more fruitful approach would be to take the radical critiques of colonialism that were elaborated by members of the International African Service Bureau and dovetail them with Dickinson's own, rather naive and apologetic representation of the British Empire. What the Pan-African intellectuals associated with the organization brought to the table, as Priyamvada Gopal explains, was an analysis which insisted on considering the relationship between fascism and colonialism in a global frame, rather than conveniently depicting them as opposed geopolitical forces. George Padmore, in particular, coined the term colonial fascism to describe those authoritarian, racist, and violent practices of governance that were applied in colonial contexts by the putatively democratic nations. The implication was that, as Robin Kellin has observed, fascism was not some aberration from the march of progress, an unexpected right-wing turn, but a blood relative of European capitalism and imperialism. I stop and listen to the voices of the Pan-African intellectuals and let their lucid analysis and critiques of empire and colonialism refract and reverberate across the sealed surface of Dickinson's archive. British imperialism will not fight Italy either for Abyssinia or for collective security. It will fight for British imperialist interests and nothing else. But imperialism remains imperialism. An African in Eritrea is no worse off under Italian fascism than an African in Congo under democratic Belgium or a Rhodesian copper miner. C.L.R. James. Habits once formed are difficult to get rid of. That is why we maintain that colonies are the breeding ground for the type of fascist mentality which is being let loose in Europe today. The fight against fascism cannot be separated from the right of all colonial peoples and subject races to self-determination. For any people who help to keep another people in slavery are at the same time forging their own chains. To conceive of getting rid of the capitalists without smashing up the empire is like trying to make the omelette without smashing the egg. George Padmore. The hour has struck for our complete emancipation. We will not tolerate the invasion of Abyssinia. Black women are united with their men in this resolve. You said you brought us from Africa to Christianize us, but the only Christianity you gave us was 300 years of enslavement. You have talked about the white man's burden. Now we are carrying yours and standing between you and fascism. Hemi Ashwood-Garvey. File 2, Colonial Remakes. With Ashwood Garvey, Padmore, and James' radical critiques of empire still resounding in my ears, I open a new file and consider the films that Dickinson shot in Africa, which were made with either the support of or directly commissioned by the Colonial Office. Dickinson's directorial debut, The High Command, released in 1937, the same year of Record of War, was set and partly shot in the Gold Coast, today Ghana, then under British rule. Africa provides a mere exotic backdrop, a general atmosphere on which a battle of a British identity plays out. In Dickinson's second film, set in Africa, Men of Two Worlds, released in 1946, I'm struck by a particular scene. A makeshift screen is set up in a clearance in the forest. The tribe is gathered around it, their faces lit up in the blue glare of the projected images. A woman's voice, at once rigid, didactic, and authoritarian, explains to the audience the meaning of what they see. In The Path of Heroes, the fascist propaganda film that Dickinson had undercut juxtaposing it to a Soviet counter-propaganda documentary, we find an almost identical scene. The widescreen is stretched, the crowd summoned. The projected images are surely different. In the latter, military parades swept across the streets of Rome, the fascist propaganda machine in full display. In Dickinson's Screen Within a Screen, an educational film about sleeping sickness and the importance of evacuating the tsetse fly-infested bush is shown. Yet both embody the same colonial attitude and media strategy, using the medium of film to instruct and inculcate. Commissioned by the British Colonial Office, Men of Two Worlds was conceived as a wartime propaganda project. Set in Tanganyika territory, the British share of former German East Africa, its aim was to depict the British colonial presence in Africa in a favorable light. The British appear as benevolent masters concerned with the modernization and civilization of their colonial subjects and territories. The plot centers around Kizenga, a composer and pianist who, after spending 15 years in London, decided to return to his village to help the English district commissioner to combat an outburst of sleeping sickness. A man of two words, Kizenga is opposed by the village witch doctor who turns the community, including Kizenga's family, against the former. A stranger in his own home, Kizenga suffers a nervous breakdown. In a 1945 article, Dickinson describes Men of Two Worlds as representing the conflict between allied progressivism and fascism. Yet this conflict was not for Dickinson between Europe and Africa, but between a reactionary Africa and a progressive one, which, with the aid of the colonial British rule, could change for its own good. Away in the bush, Dickinson writes, there still survive amongst the slow development of tribal society the false racial pride, terrorism, and opposition to innovation, which we in Europe recognize in Nazism. The distance from Padmore's idea of colonial fascism could not be overstated. Rather than addressing the fascistic tendencies inherent in European colonialism, including British colonialism, Dickinson directs his indictment towards the traditional African culture and society, depicted as backward, reactionary, unreasonable, and refractory to the changes and innovations introduced by the putatively benign British colonial presence. The Western African Students' Union, who had agreed to help with the film's production, was not blind to its flaws and limitations. As their protracted negotiations with the Colonial Office show, they protested against various aspects of the script, claiming that the story misrepresented African customs and demeaned African figures. The little tribe is portrayed as torpid and infantile, lazy and superstitious, held in sway by a host of foreign authority figures. But the Western African Students' Union objected in particular to the characterization of the figure of a witch doctor, Magole, as a scheming outsider aiming only for power. The demonization of witch doctors as representatives of indigenous knowledge and tradition often goes hand in hand, as it does in the film, with programs of forced resettlements of local populations and land expropriation. As Silvia Federici details in her study of the witch in a colonial context, witch hunting was a deliberate strategy used by the authorities to instill terror, destroy collective resistance, silence entire communities, and turn their members against each other. It was also a strategy of enclosure, which, depending on the context, could be enclosure of land, bodies, and social relations. In the Man of Two Worlds, the transfer of a population to a new settlement on higher ground is justified by the need to set fire to the bush and thus destroy the tsetse fly, which is causing the sleeping sickness. Yet such a humanitarian aim hides other, less altruistic reasons. These other motivations sometimes slip out into the open, as when District Commissioner Randall reveals that the resettlement will increase the population density and make it easier to marshal and control. Dickinson illustrates the resettlement by showing a population that is actively mobilized, not forcibly deported. Set to an encouraging soundtrack, montage sequences show them as they build a road, erect a bridge, clear the land, construct houses. In this vision, a paternalistic colonial rule appears to benignly facilitate the cultivation of both land and people. According to Randall, the land is worn out and the little lack initiative. Part of his task is to get them working. Yet, as an African reviewer of the film, James N. Hewa has suggested, the Litu's reluctance to move can also be read as a form of resistance in itself, a reaction informed by their previous experiences of colonialism and forced labor. The utopian ending of the film, showing natives in trucks happily crossing the bridge towards new lands, obscures and falsifies the real conditions under which such population resettlements often took place. It is here that the limitations of Dickinson, Man of Two Worlds, come into full sight. The film mixture of liberal openness and colonial hubris is ultimately predicated on the imperial faith that meaningful change could only come from European civilization, as well as a paternalistic understanding of freedom and self-rule as something that could only be granted from outside and whose endowment was forever delayed under the pretext of gradualist caution. As an officer of a colonial office noted, Man of Two Worlds shows British administration through appropriately rosy spectacles. The voices of James, Padmore, Ashwood Garvey, and other anti-colonial intellectuals can help us shatter these rosy spectacles. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elisa. So we're now going to move into conversation again with all our researchers, moderated by Sarah Maherta, who is manager of UAL's Archives and Special Collections Centre. Again, if you have any questions, please post these to the chat. Thanks.
Thank you, Elisa, for that incredibly rich and provocative paper. Explaining how you've used the Thorold Dickinson archive and how you've looked at these very challenging issues through your paper. I'm just posting into the chat the link to the Thorold Dickinson archive, which you showed on the screen a little earlier, for anybody who wants to follow it up. And to maybe we can start by having a discussion around the process of the research. And I mean, as you pointed out, archives are always partial and lacking. They're always biased. They're never complete records. And that really brings us face to face with the silences of an archive, as well as what they actually show. And that poses challenges, especially to the kind of speculative research that you are undertaking. And I wondered if it might be interesting for you to sort of say a little bit more about those challenges of the process of the speculative research.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the question, Sarah. I think, it started from a particular kind of hypothesis when I started my research, which was really like trying to find more information about like this screening that happened in 1937. And that was actually like my only knowledge of Thorold Dickinson, because I didn't, I wasn't an expert of Thorold Dickinson. So I started from that screening because I saw it when it was actually restaged in 2017. And I thought it was a really powerful kind of screening that use this dovetailing and this juxtaposition in order to actually criticize what at the time was like the fascist invasion of Ethiopia. And I also kind of mistakenly maybe thought that Thorold Dickinson was a much more kind of anti-colonial person than it actually turns out to be. So when I started to do research in the archive, I was actually confronted with things that weren't what I was expecting. And I was trying to find kind of traces of this kind of micro event, and also to, see it in the context in which it happens, and a context that in the archive, because you have this way of, cataloging things according to what particular kind of, individual in this case, so it's the Thorold Dickinson collection. So you always have a particular way of looking at this that completely erases things that were happening at the same time, and then maybe could have, there could have been like potential encounters there. So in a way, I did like this kind of speculative sort of exercise of trying to see if those connections took place. And then at some point in my research, I realized that there was a kind of absurdity in trying to, to find this kind of encounters, and that it made much more sense instead to think about how, bringing together these stories that the archive kept separate could help us to undo and to kind of read in a different ways the things that are in the Dickinson archive. So, in a way, I've tried to bring that dovetailing by using, by actually, listening to those voices and to those other critics of empire, and bring them in the Thorold Dickinson archive to look at his own actually representation of empire. So for me, that was a kind of, way of enriching what was in the archive, but also kind of, contesting some of the things that are there that we don't tend to look through this other perspective, which was much needed, I thought. I don't know if that answers to the question.
Of course, yes, thank you. Yes, so do you think that your project changed? Did this sort of, you've talked about how you started with one premise and then you realised you had to move a little bit and start to bring things together, and this sort of process of changing and dovetailing seems to be sort of demonstrated through the paper of your research.
Yeah, I think it was like, kind of necessary, like to change things when I started to see different things in the archive, and the project became more like a deconstructive sort of project than it was at the beginning. And so the kind of second section, which is there now, and then there will be a third kind of file in that. But these other sections look at the archive that is there and try to actually undo it in what is in the archive, really. So yeah, there was definitely a change throughout the process, and kind of using that that dovetailing sort of method was for me to juxtapose different pieces of information that come not just from that archive but from other places as well.
Yes, thank you. I can see there's a hand up in the audience of Pratap Ragani. Would you like to come in, Pratap? Are you there? Maybe you're muted. Okay, we'll carry on. Pratap can come in when he's available again. So yes, I mean you've mentioned the dovetailing, and I mean I kind of we often talk about serendipitous searching and finding of things, sort of through research practices, through going into archives and libraries. Of course, this year you've had the added challenge of not really being able to engage with the archive physically terribly well, or very often. So that was very much forefronted in your research. But also it seems to me as though your research practice was far more deliberate, and you were sort of finding these links and as you've said, bringing together in your articulation of your work, you know, the events that are scarcely noted in the archives, but are separated through the practice of curating the archive, as it were. So that process of dovetailing seems to me particularly interesting. I wondered if there's if you wanted to expand on that. I can see a couple more hands up too, so we'll have a look at that.
Yeah, shall I go ahead or shall I?
Yes, Elisa, and then Pratap.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, this kind of idea of dovetailing was really bringing things that generally are kept separate, and I was kind of thinking around this idea of like the segregation of knowledge that I actually take from a paper written by West and William Martin. Is actually the introduction of the book that is called From Toussaint to Tupac, that looks at the kind of at the segregation of certain particular histories, especially of like Black history that come from different contexts, so from the US and other contexts that are kept in a separation, and so it's not possible to see this kind of unified, you know, series of struggles there. And so this idea of thinking what we can do instead to kind of disrupt that sort of separation through the method of dovetailing was something that was very much at the center of what I was trying to do.
Thank you, Pratap.
Hi there. Yes, I'm sorry, my audio was muted. Thank you for unmuting it, and I've been trying to put the question in the chat, which is also muted, but so I'll read it. But thank you so much for the presentations, and really fantastic event. Elisa, I had a question for you. I'm just going to read it from what I put in the chat. Great paper and imagery. Does Dickinson offer a written assessment or critique of Pan-Africanism? And also the ethnocentrism of Pan-Africanism, which has been a subject of debate within different liberation movements. And I wondered if you'd found that, whether you think that later influenced his approach to the UN and UNESCO and his work there.
Yeah, I think he had a, you know, a very sort of, you know, I call it naive. I don't know if it's like the right term, but he had like a sense of, you know, it was a kind of very liberal sort of person that thought that you needed to have this kind of international kind of alliances which were important for him. And you mentioned there, which is another important point of his practice, that he was active at the UN, was actually the director of the film unit at the UN from 1956 to 1960 for 4 years. And it's actually a very interesting moment, because it's also the moment in which you have like the decolonization and the kind of independence of many countries in that period, but enter within that organization. And that's something that I'm trying to map. I'm trying to map these two stories onto each other in the third kind of file that I will be writing about. And I think he had still this this very, idealistic idea of what that international cooperation could do. And in this idealistic idea, it wasn't seeing actually what were the hierarchical orders that were present in an organization like the United Nations, and that were carried over from what was the League of Nations before. So I thought it was really interesting also to focus on this particular moment, which is the invasion of Ethiopia, because that invasion of Ethiopia showed how there was a hierarchical order in the League of Nations. And I think these things will be carried over after. So I don't know if this answers to your question, because actually you were talking, like you were asking about like the Pan-African movement more specifically. So I'm not exactly sure about his judgment on that, because I think it wasn't very. I'm trying to bring this link with the Pan-African movement, but I'm not sure it was something that was in his mind.
Okay. It's an interesting speculation, and thank you for taking us to that place. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you, Pratap. Maybe this is the moment to ask the other presenters, the other researchers in residence, if they have any comments or questions for Elisa. Oka? Thank you. I can't hear you, but you don't seem to. You don't seem to be muted.
Yes.
Yes.
Can you hear me now? Okay, apologies. Thank you so much, Elisa. I learned so much, and it's also been great to see the evolution of your research project. You know, like from the beginning of what you thought it was going to be, and to now. You know, I think it's really great. And I wanted to ask something that actually kind of builds on Pratap's question, which is I noticed that Thorold Dickinson also went to India, for instance. And those are also in the archives. And so I was wondering if you noticed the same sort of colonial racism and paternalism in other areas, and sort of whether there was, I was going to ask a question about, making linkages between Afro-Asian solidarities with regards to Thorold Dickinson, but maybe you already answered a bit of that in Pratap's question, but I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, that's a great question, because that's another bit that should enter at some point in that paper, and especially in the kind of colonial remakes section that I was looking especially at Men of Two Worlds, but in the same period he actually visits India, as you noted there, in 1946, and he was actually there when there is the revolt in 1946. So it was there at the moment, and it writes a report and also letters about these events. And you can see the same sort of mentality that plays out there on this sort of idea of again a paternalistic vision of colonialism and what kind of progresses could be done in the country with the introduction of constructions of a dam in a particular place. All this kind of issues come back in that particular specific place in his time in India as well. And he uses the expression Men of Two Worlds. He had just finished the film to talk about certain Indian people that, according to him, were in between two worlds. So there is again this kind of projecting a particular kind of image on other places in the world. So yeah, I think it's really important what you say there of the counterpoint to that, and what that kind of African Asian connection against those particular was particular forms of British colonial presence is something that I should actually link up more. But thank you for the question.
Thank you. Anna, would you like to come in?
Yes, thank you so much. I agree also with Oka. It's been so amazing to see the process of the research. And I think my question might be outside of the scope of this project, but I wondered if you have thought about that restaging that you attended in 2017. Mm-hmm. And have thought of, any details or any other traces that you might want to connect to the first screening. I mean, it's they are far from each other, but in this idea of unsettling history, maybe.
Can you repeat the? Because
So if you have thought of any details of that restaging in 2017, I don't know exactly the context of that, but is there anything that could resonate with the initial screening?
Yeah, that's really interesting, because actually the screening was remade 3 times. So the first time it was in 1937, then it was restaged by Dickinson himself in 1969, and at the time he was a professor of film at the Slade. And so it was redone in that occasion within a series of lectures that had to do with the history of the 20th century, and that were organized by AGP Taylor. And then again, in 2017, you have this restaging that was staged by Henry K. Miller in collaboration with Bridget Lowe at the UCL. And I think in that restaging, there was first of all a kind of way of actually change the reels in real time while doing the projection. So it was a kind of very difficult technical exercise to do. And it was, they were trying to think about ideas of fake news, and so the kind of, post-truth sort of scenario we find ourselves in, because there was like this example of a film that was using the technique of dovetailing and montage to actually deconstruct like a particular kind of propaganda that was put out by the fascist regime in Italy. Then, of course, you have, I think you have a lot of things there, because then you have a counter-propaganda film from a Soviet perspective. But, there is something that I was really aware during the process of a lacking of actual local voices. And also when I talk about the Pan-African movement, it's also kind of, a projection that come from outside, from a big extent. So there are a lot of things there that, need to be kind of investigated further. But yeah, and they tried also to make like this connection with like a sort of post-colonial reading of that particular film, and they had Neelam Srivastava as a person that was talking as a scholar in especially in like Italian colonialism, which was talking about this after the screening. So there was like, the screening was already doing a lot of things that actually made me think, and then I've tried to kind of bring in this connection to actually, think about this screening in a kind of larger context. Yes, Mohammad.
Mohammad.
Oh, you are muted.
Thank you so much, Elisa. Same as Oka and Anna, I have to say it's great to see your development of the project, and thank you so much for the presentation. My question is basically kind of elaboration on the previous questions, and I'm quite interested to know, within the context of your paper that you're writing now and the overall research, are you touched on the idea of post-truth and the whole sort of the problem and confrontation that the challenges that we confront in our time. Have you thought to sort of create a kind of connection between the archival material that you looked at in order to interpret those things within the context of right now, and try to sort of pick a few examples to see how those material that you looked at could be representative within the context of contemporary examples in our,
Yeah, that's a very good question. Thanks, Mohammed, for that. Because I think there is like a a risk for the kind of historical scope of my research focusing on the 1930s to kind of like seem as if it was like a kind of historicist or antiquarian even kind of sort of research, and like the thinking about the present was very much in my mind, and it was something that I was thinking, especially thinking about the kind of myths and mythologies that we have in the post-Second World War period on a kind of rewriting of a particular history of empire up to then. And it's something where you have, especially in the kind of public discourse, this sort of dichotomy that is then perpetrated between a kind of Halide sort of progressivism, which of course they had their colonial empire, but they were better than the kind of fascist imperialism. And I think that there is a kind of danger in this particular position, and I think it's important to look instead at those kind of critiques of empire which were much more radical, and they were looking at the kind of fascist and like the fascist characters that were present in any form of colonialism. And this is something that you find, of course, in the Anglophone sphere with C.L.R. James, so George Padmore or Eniash Burgavi, but you find also in the Francophone sphere with Aimé Césaire and this discourse on colonialism. So this was like a position that was, very much held at the moment, but then it seems to be completely kind of submerged or distorted in the kind of myths that are told in the Second World War period. And I think this kind of things are still present in the conversation that we have around empire in the UK in this present moment, and especially around the kind of the kind of myths also around the figure of Churchill, for instance, or the kind of things that it represents within that. And so I'm thinking back at the Black Lives Matter protest in the summer, and when there was like this kind of brigade of people defending the Churchill monument and doing like the Nazi salute under that, which according to particular sort of narratives should be like a paradoxical thing, but actually if you look instead at the actual history, and also the fact that Churchill was a sympathizer of Mussolini, then it's like you unravel and you unearth a different kind of story there. So that was something that was in my mind. I don't know if my if my project is is just trying to kind of look at things. And I think that Priyambada Gopal, who I quote, she's really good with this kind of things and what she calls like the myths of the post Second World War period. So yeah. I hope that answers to your question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Mohammed. Thank you, Elisa. I think we may have time to just quickly address the question that's in the chat, although I'm sure Susan wants to draw us to the lunch break. But just to reference that Ilaria has kindly put in the chat to Elisa, thank you so much for your amazing paper, Elisa. Coming from a museum background, I'm thinking about how such archives, e.g. the Dickinson one, can be displayed, shown to a wider public, thinking how certain museum pieces or collections could be put in dialogue or given context with certain archives. So I don't know if there's anything more you want to briefly touch on with that. I feel you have covered that slightly in some of your earlier conversations.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's not something I've been doing actively through kind of I've tried to do it like by bringing these documents together in my paper, but I think that there is a lot of work that can be done actually to construct like different narratives. So yeah, thank you for the question, Ilaria.
Thank you for the question, Ilaria, and thank you, Elisa, and thank you so much for your amazing paper. Thank you for the contributions of the presenters here in the questions and answers, and I'll hand over to Susan.
Thank you, Sarah. So yes, we're going to stop here to break for lunch, and let me echo the thanks to Oka and Elisa for your incredible presentations, and to Anna, Mohammad, Gustavo and Sarah for the conversations and reflections so far. So we'll see everyone back here at 1:45 for part 2 of the Decolonising Archives Symposium, and please remember to keep your mics and cameras off in the meantime. Thank you.